question is how to introduce somebody who needs no introducing. So I met Rokelle Lerner in May of 2015 at a dinner in Antigua. And I was trying to show off to her that I knew a lot about recovery literature. So I said, you know, my favorite book is the ACOA Daily Affirmations. Do you know it? She said, I wrote it. So that didn't go well for me, but then I saw her speak, and that was fantastic. But I think the most amazing thing that I've seen with this woman is I've seen her work with families, with addicts, with alcoholics, and distressed people. And I've seen her begin to put the building blocks of a life in recovery for everybody. So with that, Rokelle Lerner.
Thank you, Nikos. Maybe it's because I wrote a book on narcissism. He told me the introduction was going to be 30 minutes, so I started to relax. Thank you for the kind introduction, and welcome, everybody. It's such a pleasure to be here, and congratulations to the iCAAD staff. This conference gets better and better and better every year, and it's really an honor to be with like-minded souls, people who've made a commitment in their lives to heal from the ravages of addiction and to help people heal from the ravages of addiction. It's a real privilege speaking to you. And I'm also obviously represented and sponsored by Crossroads Antigua. You know, at my age, I am a senior clinical advisor. Senior clinical advisor, yeah. And at my age, I really, I wasn't that interested in getting involved with another treatment center, but Crossroads is a special place. And it has that combination of compassion and clinical excellence, and I really appreciate working down there. So today, I'm going to be speaking about emotional sobriety. And it says the undiscovered frontier in healing relationships. I think it's discovered. It isn't well understood, is my belief. And my goal is to empower you, to help you with some concepts and perhaps some exercises that will help empower couples in recovery to turn from reactivity into integrity. From reactivity to integrity. And I always like to show my email. If you want to contact me, if you want a set of slides, please write to me. And I always like to say I'm available for anniversaries, weddings, bar mitzvahs, different occasions. So what I'd like to do is start by showing you a slide of, I call this Relationships in the New Millennium. And it says this: with the right combination of therapy and medication, Clarence and Ethel had a long, committed relationship. And I also want to show you this slide, which shows a new life in sobriety. And it looks like this. A new life in sobriety. I'm sorry, dear, I haven't been listening. Could you repeat what you've said since we've been married, please? Now, before I begin, I want to credit some great sources here. Some sources I'd recommend to people, some sources that I've used. First of all, there's Haiti and Yumi Schleifer, who say that our relationships happen in the space in between us, and everything your partner says in the present is a child trying to tell their story. And many of us realize that. It's just in relationship. In other words, this is something I know. But when we get into our relationships, it seems to go out the window. And so I love talking about relationships because sometimes I say something so profound, I hope I'm listening. It's the truth. Nobody's got this down. So here's Hetty and Yumi Schleifer. Then there's Esther Perel. I love Esther Perel, who says, allow people to define the state of their union and what they long for. And I love this. Most of us will have 2 or 3 significant relationships in our life, and sometimes that's with the same person when we do our work. Then there's Janine Fisher, who has done a lot of work here in the UK, who says emotional memory converts the past into expectations of the future. Emotional memory. With unresolved trauma, you tend to experience the present as if it was the past. No, it's the reverse. Yeah, no, that's true. You tend to experience the present as if it was the past. There used to be an old commercial in the US advertising audio tapes, and the brand was called Memorex. And the caption was, "It's not live, it's Memorex." That's what Janine Fisher says about trauma. And finally, David Schnarch. How many are aware of David Schnarch? How many have heard of him? If you can say his name, you can read his books. Schnarch. Many people say they want intimacy, but what they're really longing for is acceptance, validation, and unconditional love. A solid, flexible sense of self lets you stand on your own 2 feet without always standing on your partner's toes. So I draw from these people, and I was kind of a hippie. Not really, you couldn't tell now, but I love those days. But there was a man named Eric Hoffer, who had a wonderful quote, and his quote was, "In times of change, it is the learners that inherit the earth," no pun intended. It's the learners that inherit the earth, while the learned find themselves beautifully equipped to deal with a world that no longer exists. Clinicians are facing issues and problems today that I think no one who trained us thought would be a reality. And there have been amazing scientific advances in this field, amazing. But as a society, we still do not know how to heal our relationships. And ladies and gentlemen, the violence, the chaos in the world is just a macrocosm of what's going on between people. It's what's going on between you and I. And we know that supportive, healthy relationships is tantamount to long-term recovery. I mean, we know that. I think we need to put together our research with our creativity, our perseverance, our persistence, and develop absolute primary couples work during the course of treatment someday. And without that, addicts don't really leave the prison, do they? They learn to decorate their jail cells a little better, because we'll see them again and again, or they'll go through some kind of dry drunk, like a guy I worked with who's miserable in his relationship, and he says to me, "I'm clean as a whistle and miserable as hell." So in his letter from the Grapevine, Bill W. talks about the development of maturity, balance, and humility in all our relationships. A relationship with self, relationship with others, relationship with higher power. And he also says this. He goes on to say, and I quote, that his dependence wasn't just on alcohol. That when he got sober, he said, "For my dependence meant demand." He says, "Demand for the possession and control of other people and conditions surrounding me." That's Bill W. So what is emotional sobriety? What does that mean? Well, emotional sobriety, I take it to mean, number one, when the best of us does the thinking and talking. When our emotional well-being is determined by our inner guidance, not by other people or situations. When we can tolerate intense emotions without acting out, without foreclosing on our feeling life, or self-medicating. And this is the mantra I use and I teach for emotional sobriety. You may not be able to control your emotions, but you can control your behavior. Actually, I'd like to hear everybody say that. If you can't control your emotions, say that. If you can't, you can control your behavior. And to me, that's the doorway to emotional sobriety. Because what we're talking about here is really self-regulation. Self-regulation and building one's integrity. And part of the problem is, that without the right guidance, even people who attend meetings religiously, well, let me put it this way. At Crossroads, we have a sophisticated treatment, but 12-step recovery is central to our philosophy. But what I've observed in my years of work, both in the US and the UK, is that many can go to meetings for years, share deeply, work the steps around their addiction, but to go home and share deeply with the people that mean the most. Sadly, for many, the principles of the 12-step do not translate into intimate relationships. And for many, I'm not saying everybody. A man, for example, that I worked with, a recovering guy who attends AA and has been clean and sober for 5 years, yet feels free to go home and give his wife the silent treatment for a week because she forgot to pick up the dry cleaning. And he has little kids running around, stonewalling for a week. Another woman that I worked with who almost pushed her partner down the stairs because she said her partner was giving her a look that threatened her sobriety. Something wrong with this picture, wouldn't you say? Wouldn't you say? And, I think this is part of what Bill W. is talking about. The need to translate the notions of the steps into our relationships. So some of you have seen this. And, would you hold this microphone? I'm not stripping, honest, but it's hot up here. So I'm going to take this off. Nico said I'm disappointed. No, you're not. Okay. That was a joke. What I want to show you is the 12 steps of intimacy in reverse. Okay, you ready for this? Number 1, step 1, I decided my life would be wonderful if my spouse would change. I firmly believe there is no greater power than myself, and anyone who says so is insane. In my relationship, I made a decision to remove my will from God, who really doesn't understand this situation. I made a searching and thorough inventory of my partner so he or she can't fool me or take advantage of me. Step 5, I tried to get my spouse to admit to me the exact nature of his wrong. Step 6, I became willing to help her get rid of her defects of character. Step 7, I was humble enough to ask him to remove his shortcomings for his own best interest. Step 8, I made a list of all the ways my spouse has harmed me and always wait patiently for a chance to get even. Step 9, I get even whenever possible, except when to do so would get me in trouble. Step 10, continuing to take her inventory, I promptly make my partner admit her wrongdoing on a regular basis. Step 11, sought through manipulation and control to get my partner to see that my ideas are best and that she ought to surrender to my will. Step 12, having maintained my emotional problems for years with these steps, I can thoroughly recommend them to others who wish to practice neurosis and loneliness in their relationships for the rest of their days. 12 steps of intimacy in reverse. So before I go any further, bless you, before I go any further, I want to just talk about love for a couple minutes, because love is what it's about. So when I talk about love, the falling in love part is bliss. It is bliss. Some people don't fall in love. They don't surrender that way. They step in it a little bit. But for those of us who've fallen in love, it's blissful. It's just too bad that bliss, so to speak, doesn't sustain with the trials and tribulations of everyday life. And folks, the ones who put that best aren't psychologists, they're country western singers. Absolutely, with titles that sum it up. Titles like, How Can I Miss You If You Won't Go Away? I'm so miserable without you, it's like having you here. See, my wife ran off with my best friend, and I sure do miss him. And the last one is a little off color. It's Garth Brooks, one of the lines in his songs that says, see if I can get this right, it's hard to kiss the lips at night that chew your ass off all day long. I think it's, and I have to say that relationships, maybe like you, they've always fascinated me. That's probably why I still keep having them. And there is life is really God's way sometimes of see if we can take a joke, because every single person comes to relationship with a partner that is capable of giving them the worst nightmare. We tend to attract people to ourselves who begin to show us the things about ourselves that we want to forget. There's a man, an author named Pat Conroy. He wrote The Prince of Tides, The Great Santini. And Pat Conroy said this: all of us have heard of people who have healthy, sustained, committed, passionate relationships. But very few of us have met any of the members of the tribe up close. He says it's a little like studying the Inca Indians. You can read about these people in books, you can research their ruins, but very few of us know couples with that sustained passion, along with commitment, along with emotional bonding, that really makes them tick. You know, how many believe that there's such a thing called healthy dependency? You believe that? Of course there is. Healthy dependency. The Japanese call it sweet dependency. In the US, we call it interdependency. And, I guess I'm done. Hold on a minute. Interdependency. And interdependency means that if you love someone, then caring for their needs must coexist with taking responsibility and caring for your own. That's interdependency. And very few people that I know have reached this mark. I mean, it's an ongoing developmental task, this, to be able to acknowledge and meet your own needs when you love someone. And that interdependency is, then of course there's codependency, right? They still use that word here, right? Yeah. Do they? Okay. So codependency, when we allow ourselves to become so distracted by another that it pulls us away from our connection, our own heart and soul. And this disconnection is the source of great pain. We need to control others in order to keep our guts quiet, in order to soothe ourselves. And of course, many of you have heard me talk about this before. The first codependents were Cinderella and Snow White. Both of them coming from clinically interesting families, both of them. Raised by critical stepmothers. One wants to marry a guy who calls himself the prince and develops a shoe fetish. And Snow White, was probably on cocaine. Snow White, really? Really? And this is the one who surrounds herself with small asexual little men. And then waits for a necrophile in the woods, some guy who likes to kiss dead women in the forest. It's a sick story. And then we have the first love avoidance, like Peter Pan, like Jack and the Beanstalk, running away, not being seen. I think Peter Pan was closeted, actually. I won't go into that right now. Relationships make people become what they can be. It is the tool for human evolution. And it is also the most rigorous spiritual and psychological path that you can take, if you're mindful about it. I like the poet Rumi when he says that love is that flame that once kindled burns everything, and only the journey and the great spirit remain. Love brings up anything unlike itself, and that's Rumi. And then what we have is Terence Real. Know Terence Real? He's written some great relationship books, who says that relationship is not for the faint of heart. Love is like pouring Miracle Grow in your character defects. We know that. Love is not for the faint of heart. And side effects include weight gain, depression, and loss of sex drive. Ask your doctor if marriage is right for you, One of the beauties of relationships is that relationships don't ask you if you want to grow or not. And as soon as we stop growing in relationship, it takes the passion right out of there. When you stop taking risks. And when couples are bored, it's because they've stopped taking risks with each other. Emotional risks. Now, working at Crossroads, we get people who are single. We get people who are married. You know, there's always dealing with the treatment center romance sometimes. But we try to coach people to wait. I mean, the AA suggests 1 year. I mean, if we can get them to wait 3 months, it's a big deal. But, you know, I've often, when I heard the AA suggestion, waiting 1 year before you get into intimate relationships, I thought, well, how controlling is that? And then I learned why. First of all, the expectations and questions in recovery are bizarre. Like, now that I'm sober, I'm going to go to NA or AA and meet somebody else who's sober and we'll have the perfect life together. Or, now that I'm not using, how do I handle my flashbacks during intimacy? That's a big question. My partner and I have never had sex sober. It's going to be wonderful, or I'm not going to be able to have it. So they're splitting, black and white. I'm in recovery. I'm not attracted to my wife anymore. I'll probably leave my relationship. I think my sponsor's cute. You know, they're not thinking clearly. And we also know that from Helen Fisher's work, and if you want to know more about the biology of love, Dr. Helen Fisher from Harvard, it's a fabulous resource. Fabulous resource. So we know also that love is biological. But one of the first things I ask people is, well, what's a healthy relationship to you? What is it? What is healthy? And there's all kinds of ways to describe that. I believe this is one of the best definitions I've seen. This is from the Stone Center at Wellesley. A wonderful woman named Jean Baker Miller described the hallmarks, what she calls, of a growth-fostering relationship. One hallmark is that each person has a greater sense of vitality. Have you ever been in relationships where it drains and saps you of every bit of your energy? Mm-hmm. Each person has more desire for connection with the other instead of less. Each person has a more accurate picture of himself and others. And each person feels a greater sense of worth. That doesn't mean, obviously, you get your self-worth all from your relationship, but it increases your worth rather than diminishes your worth. Each person has a greater motivation for fulfilling their purpose in the world. These are hallmarks of a growth-fostering relationship. How many recognize these in their relationship? I'm just saying. Any of these? How many recognize them but don't want to raise their hand? A few of you. Okay, great. So this is symptoms of disempowerment, which is obvious the opposite. Lack of vitality, confusion, diminished self-worth, diminished creativity, and turning away from relationships. And there's another way I like to describe what healthy relating is. Anybody ever heard of the Sternberg triangle? Okay. Robert Sternberg from Yale University wrote a book called The Three Sides of Love. And he describes that the three sides of love are, the most important ingredients are intimacy, commitment, and passion. He says the greater the degree of each, the greater the love. Now, I don't know anybody who has an equal triangle. It depends actually on what you want and what you can tolerate. Some people, let me say, intimacy is the degree of emotional closeness, your ability to emotionally bond and self-disclose. Commitment is about your integrity, and it's about the decision, I choose to be here with you. You know, the words "till death do us part" come from the Middle Ages, where the lifespan was about 30. It means something very different today. So asking people in recovery, what is it that you can commit to with integrity in your life? If it's till death, great. But people renew their commitments. I've worked with couples who decide that their commitment is that if anybody wants to leave the relationship, they're going to close the exits, and they've committed to work on the relationship for 18 months before anybody goes anywhere. That's their commitment. And when I say close the exits meaning affairs, exits meaning overworking. The TV can be an exit, can't it? Anything that takes you away from intimacy. I mean, not to be crass, but this woman told me that if the dog is getting more touching than she is. The TV is getting turned on more than she is. I mean, that's an exit, right? If you're reading the kids 8 books a night instead of 1, it's an exit. And finally, passion. And what Sternberg talks about is physical passion. But what this really means is that it's important that couples have a shared passion. There's an ebb and flow to sexual desire. There's an ebb and flow. But if couples are going to make it, they have to have a shared passion. Whether it's their spiritual path, whether it's books, whether it's their some kind of shared passion. Now, some people are long on intimacy, long on commitment, very short on passion. And this can be a companionate relationship. It's the kind of relationship, remember, my grandparents had. Some people are short on intimacy, long on commitment, short on passion. And these are some of those long-term, empty relationships. So the question that I ask people is, what do you want? This is where it begins. This is where it begins. And Esther Perel likes to talk about the fact that, this is so important to begin with what people want in a relationship. So I pose this question to you and to the clients I work with. The question is, what does your heart long for? What does your heart long for? And that question can apply to anything, but I do ask it of family members, and particularly when I work with couples. Some people can't tolerate a lot of intimacy. Some people are not interested in physical passion that much anymore. What is it you want? And I actually pair people up, and if we had time, I would do that today. To ask and just give them each a minute and talk about what does your heart long for? And then ask them what stops you. What stops you? And ask how they sabotage themselves. What's a specific sign that you're achieving what you want? What support do you need? And probably the most important question, which is, what can you tolerate getting? What can you tolerate getting? It's a funny question to ask. Let me give you an example. A fella, an addict who went through crossroads. He came to family program, wanted his wife to come, and he longed to be touched. He described himself as touch-starved. Yet when we got into family program, his partner started complaining bitterly that every time she hugged him, he would stiffen up like a board and become irritated. So she stopped. She took it really personally. Or a recovering addict I work with who yearned for emotional connection. Just yearned for that closeness. But when her husband came to family program, he said something interesting. That through the years, whenever he tried to emotionally share with his wife, she would not look at him. She didn't look at him. When she talks to him, she won't look at him. And yet she yearns for this emotional closeness. Look, if you received no touch at all growing up, or harmful touch, then even when somebody offers you the possibility of healthy touch, your brain is already wired for pain. And when a client can't make eye contact, that's attachment learning, folks. A lot of the time, that's attachment learning. That's about being a small child and looking into eyes that were either cold or glazed over. If I'm a baby and I'm looking into eyes that are scary, I'm going to look away. And now that client's in treatment, and she can't even look at us, the therapists, let alone look at her husband, because the habit of looking away has been so well learned procedurally. It's a habit. It's ingrained. And of course, when she first came and wouldn't look at us, oh, she's lying. She's not telling the truth. She's hiding something. And it turns out, after finding out her background, why in the world would she look at us in the eyes? It has very little to do with her partner, but of course our partners take it personally. Of course they do. Because these people don't have the memory or the words to explain it. So both of these individuals finally reported getting what they longed for. And when they reported getting what they longed for, they said rather than pleasant, it brought up really intense, uncomfortable feelings. Folks, when you long for something long enough, so to speak, and you don't get it, your brain does associate it with pain. And when it finally shows up, the longing ends, but the grief begins. But the grief begins. And it takes people into a place that they have avoided for years. For years. So asking them what they long for is a really important question. And what can you tolerate getting? And what else stops us from getting what we long for? Everybody take a deep breath. Let it out. What else stops us? Well, since I'm talking, I'll tell you. We know the etiology of addiction is complex. We know that. But we also know that the freeway to the valley of addiction is anxious, traumatic, unpredictable relationships and attachments. When our limbic system has become so dysregulated through chronic stress or abuse or neglect, when our emotional switch gets stuck on, our brain loses some of the capacity to regulate itself. Does that make sense to you? Okay. Do you want me to repeat that? Okay. So when we have a history of abuse, neglect, trauma, crisis, we have what is called dysregulated limbic brain. And that when we get triggered, it's almost that we have a hyperarousal switch that sticks on the on. The better way to explain it is this, and I've shown this to you before. Oh, this isn't right. Hold on a minute. I got all mixed up here. So, how many here have heard the terms hyper and hypoarousal? Okay. So, yeah, it's not here. Sorry, folks. Just 1 second. Here, I'll just show you this. The reptilian brain, hypo and hyperarousal. There we go. When people have experienced trauma in their lives, there's a part of their brain called the sympathetic nervous system that gets stuck on the on switch. Hyperarousal. And hyperarousal is panic, rage, fight, flight. Stuck on, yes. Some people go to the opposite, and they go to hypoarousal, and their switch gets stuck on off, which is dissociation, checking out, freezing, depression. Some people go up and down. They just go up and down between hyper and hypo. In the middle, there's something called the resilient zone, the optimal zone. And this is where one sign that people are in that optimal zone is that they are able to think and feel at the same time. They don't get stuck into all emotion, and they don't get stuck into completely shutting off emotions. The optimal zone. People will still go up and down in emotion, but they'll go within limits when they learn mindfulness techniques, relapse prevention. This is really helpful to show families about hyper and hypoarousal. And some people who can't express their feelings, they're able to say, I'm going into hyper or I'm going into hypo. It's really helpful. They don't feel so crazy. And when we tend to act out, this is the amygdala. When couples have these raging fights, they're in their reptile brain. Their reptilian brain. And, reptiles kill their young. Just remember that. Reptiles don't do relationships. When clients can begin to recognize, and partners can recognize when they go into the reptilian brain, and you know how they know? It's the body. The body doesn't lie, and the body will always tell you. Hyperventilating, stomach knots, palm sweating. You're going into reptile here. And when you're in reptilian brain, it's not a good idea to open your mouth. Not a good idea. When our clients are in reptilian brain, teach them to recognize it, but don't trust it. Don't trust it. And don't make decisions when you are fearful, angry, anxious. And be aware what part of the brain is firing. I mean, that's a trick. When I say what part of the brain is firing, the limbic brain needs connection and pleasure. Our thinking brain needs to make meaning out of things. The amygdala is a survival brain. And it's a good thing we have it. It's a good thing we have the survival brain. Would you agree? And nature made us that way, you know? So when we're standing in front of a car, we don't sit down in the street and think, should I move? Should I not? No, you just flip into action, flight, fight. It's just that when trauma occurs, we know that you tend to experience the present as if it were the past, and that's the issue. So I want to go back here for a minute about what does stop us. And part of what stops any of us from getting the kind of relationships that we love is something called invisible loyalties. Invisible loyalties. Most of us are fiercely loyal to our families, consciously or unconsciously. You know, the silver thread that connects you to your family of origin, it really doesn't go away. What we can do is become more conscious of it and how it impacts us. But invisible loyalty, I always ask, has your client inherited a loyalty of grief, a loyalty of bitterness, a loyalty of resentment? Let me explain this to you, invisible loyalty. We're all born into this world with a balance sheet, debts and credits. Debts that we're paying off generations, but also assets. So some of the debts, let's say, I'm using an example of a man I worked with at Crossroads. He had an alcoholic father who never got sober. His wife was in treatment. But he has a history of strong, accomplished men. Now, his wife is trying her best to stay sober. He's got his own ACOA issues, but he's never, you know, he feels loyal to his father, so he feels disloyal about delving into ACOA issues. He's unable to support his wife in her recovery because he's so angry with her most of the time. He feels as if he's betraying somebody by getting healthier. So, loyalty. We remain loyal to a parent's posture towards life. We remain loyal to the rules in the family. We know that. We remain loyal to unprocessed resentment in the family. And why do we remain loyal? Because on some level, for a lot of people, it feels disloyal to grow developmentally beyond parents. That we're reluctant to lose the love of a parent who in some cases couldn't be there in the first place. In other words, it has nothing to do with logic. Nothing. Nothing. This is the limbic brain. This is the little girl, little boy in all of us. I think I told you the story about, I have a mother and I was loyal to her unfulfilled purpose in her life. Her unfulfilled purpose. How many were here last year? Oh, that's great. And I wanted to, she wanted me to be a teacher. She wanted me to be a teacher, and I knew since I was this big I was supposed to be a teacher. My mother left college one semester before she married my father. She just left, never graduated, and I always knew this is what I was going to do. I'm a firstborn child. I'm supposed to be a teacher. So I went to education to train to be a teacher, and I was bored to death. Bored to death. I knew I didn't belong there. But with an invisible loyalty, you keep there's some propulsion behind you to continue. And I didn't. I graduated. I call myself a recovering English teacher. It's the worst job. How many taught school here? Like public school? It's rough, man. And I wasn't suited for it. And one day, the kids had written on the bathroom wall something awful about me. Awful. I know. This was in Kentucky. I'm not saying that as an excuse, but it just was in Kentucky. And one of the girls took her red lipstick and wrote all the way across the wall that Mrs. Lerner does something unmentionable with horses. And it's terrible. And I thought to myself, I've been so discreet. No, I'm kidding. I thought to myself, that's it. I'm done. And I went home. I was married. I was putting my hubby through school. Who's the first person I called to say I quit? My mother. My mother, who hung up on me, and I went back to school the next day to get my job back. And I lasted the rest of the year. These are these lines right here. Invisible loyalty. If people know exactly what they need to do but can't do it, ask them who they're being loyal to. If people are perpetually confused, just unable to get clarity, who are you being loyal to? If people are, like this man I talked about, if people are feeling they're betraying someone by speaking their truth or getting healthier, who are they being loyal to? People who have that kind of loyalty are unable to have what I call courageous conversations in their couplehood. They lack the ability to have courageous conversations because they keep their truth bottled up. Loyalty isn't a bad thing. But if you're walking down a path with unresolved these loyalty issues, it's not yours. It's not your path anymore. And to, letting go of these kinds of loyalties doesn't mean that you throw your family in the garbage, but often couples get stuck because of these unseen, unconscious rules, these loyalties. They're walking down the path, but it's not theirs anymore. And I think letting go of this is one of the hardest things people do. So just to keep that in mind, invisible loyalties. So this is where, I think what we do, if I were to subtitle, I'm going to skip over this for a minute. If I were to subtitle this workshop, I would call it, On a Clear Day You Can See Your Families. On a clear day you can see your families. And what we do, how many are aware of this? You take your unfinished business and you wrap it up really pretty and you give it to the people that you love. And we do this in a few ways. One way is called dependency. This is reenactment, dependency. And dependent relationships are symbiotic. It's when your need for attachment is so overwhelming that you tend to connect with people who are not in your own best interest, and you tend to make this symbiotic fused pair, and you do a dance where you really suck the life out of each other. Dependency. And by the way, it takes two people to do that dance. It always takes two. There's never one person who's the dependent. Two people have those issues. And then there's distortion, one of my personal favorites. Distortion means that you don't do this consciously. You tend to distort your view of a person or situation that has its roots in your early life. So I want to give you an example of distortion. I'll use my own life. Okay. Distortion. These are the three apocalypses, three men and women of the apocalypse of a relationship. They're destructors. So some of you have heard this before. I was raised by an alcoholic mother in recovery at 92. Not great. And because she was out of it, most of it, I had to cook dinners for my father. I had to cook dinners. And 15, 16, I could never get it right for him. He was a lovely guy. But, at 15 years old, you don't want to be cooking dinners over. It was always too spicy, not spicy enough, undercooked, overcooked, salty, not salty enough. Never mind. That was years ago. Well, years later, I'm married, and I've been married 10 years. And I'm a therapist now, and I'm standing in the kitchen making a wonderful brunch for my husband. He's now ex-husband. You'll find out in a minute. So it's a beautiful spring day in Minnesota. I'm cooking eggs. Everything's fine. And he comes up behind me and says very sweetly, he said, "Dear, don't you think you should turn those eggs over?" That's all he said. The white rage that came up, I took that spatula and I wanted to kill him. Talk about reptile. I didn't, but I slammed that thing down in the frying pan. The eggs went out and started screaming at him. "Do you think I can do this myself, for God's sakes?" Oof. Just remembering it gives me the shake. "Are you so lazy? Why don't you get into your own pigsty of a room and clean it up? Leave me alone. Get out of this kitchen." And he did. He left. He left. He left the house, and he didn't come back for the rest of the day. And when he did, we spent the rest of the day in cold stone silence. We treat the people we say we love with more disrespect and more neglect than anybody on the planet. And I say that because if friends were over, and I wouldn't do that with friends. If a stranger came, we reserve this for the people that matter most. The more intimate a relationship becomes, the more infantile we get. Because it strikes at all those old, that's distortion. Because when I was screaming at him, who was really standing behind me? My dad. Yeah. Right, that's Dad. Then there's provocation. Provocation. Anybody recognize distortion? Of course, in the people you work with, not you, right? Provocation. Provocation is when you provoke a response in somebody that's similar to the response you received as in your early life. Provocation. So here comes Judy and Arthur into my office. And Arthur's always on time. Judy's always late. Always late. She's always 10 minutes late. So Arthur comes in, plops in the chair. We're chatting, but 10 minutes go by. 20 minutes go by. 25 minutes, Judy runs in the door, plops down in the chair, looks at him, not "I'm sorry," nothing, and looks at him and says, "You don't like my hair, do you?" And he's a nice guy, a little passive, but he said, "No, dear, your hair looks fine. Don't lie to me. I can tell the way you're looking at me you don't like my hair." He said again, "It's fine," but she picked at him until he got really mad. Really mad, until he didn't like her or her hair or anything about her. And then she turns to me, this is the kicker. She turns to me and says, "Rokelle, are there any anger management courses? Do you see what happens in our relationship, Rokelle?" It's called projective identification. You provoke an emotion and then you blame them for it. That's provocation. And we all do this. We all do it sometimes. But when couples learn about this, it really gives them pause. Because this is the stuff that destroys relationship. So I would say that when this stuff happens, I've already done Reptilian Brain. Hold on. Yeah, let me just get this. I'm sorry, these are all out of order today. When this happens, here we go. there are some common triggers that provoke us. Common triggers, and let me go this. Common triggers. There was a poll done, two treatment centers, and actually Janina Fisher did this, asking clients, what triggered you most in relationship? And I was kind of surprised. Being surprised, coming up behind and giving a hug, or having a surprise party, something like that. Having to wait. How many arguments about waiting? Messy houses, being alone with others, disappointment, etc., etc. What was really interesting to me is being asked questions. Being asked questions. Therapists are nuts about asking questions. We love to ask questions. But when you grew up in a coercive, controlling environment, like some of them did, and neglect and abuse are both coercive, there is a right answer and a wrong answer for some of these kids growing up. And when you ask a question, it feels like a setup to them. It feels like a setup. Because if you give the wrong answer, you're going to be set up for abuse. So I've really taken that to heart. And instead of asking and asking questions, doing more reflection, inviting them to look inside by, drawing, doing different things so I don't grill them. Because when they're in therapy, and we know that triggers them, and anything can trigger you. I like this one, which is people take things really personally. I'm not asking you to change your spots. I'm just asking you to take the garbage out, right? And this is where boundaries come in. This is really where boundaries come in. And this is where people, I was going to write a book called I'm Okay, You're Really Sick. You're really sick. I was going to write that. I was also going to write a book about codependency, but it's too late. It was going to be called I'm Going to Be Assertive, If It's All Right With You. I'm okay, really sick. To the extent that we blame, and people who are really hurt tend to blame. The more hurt one is, the more blame you'll see. So when someone's blaming in couples relationship, I always stop and ask, what hurts so badly? To the extent we blame is the extent to which we're still stuck in our family of origin and, good old Sheldon Cope. If there's a characteristic in someone that causes great irritation, it's probably a characteristic that you have. So what we're talking about here, what I'm talking about here, this is where boundaries come in. Healthy boundaries, the crux of emotional sobriety, I believe. Everyone, take another breath. It's a long time to say. Thank you. All right. Boundaries develop through our attachment history. And when people get really triggered, we're talking about containment and emotional boundaries. People learn a lot about protection and treatment. They learn, how to protect themselves from future triggers, don't hang out with the same people, watch all kinds of things. We do a good job at that, but I'm not sure we do that great a job in teaching people how to contain themselves. I say that because once you get in touch with your feelings and you've had frozen development, all of a sudden you've got these feelings. If I have anger, I can spew it all over the place. If I have neediness, the boundaries become really loose. When people get triggered, I always ask in couples therapy, so stop a minute. How old do you feel? How old do you feel? And let's cradle that little boy or girl. Let's have some compassion for him or her. Find out what she or he wants. And mainly if you feel younger than your chronological age, that means, of course, your 6-year-old is driving the car, so we have to get his sticky fingers off the steering wheel and somehow get him in the back seat in a loving, compassionate way. Emotional boundaries. You know that phrase, if it's hysterical, it's historical? Yeah. that, of course, what any emotion is in Technicolor, it has much more to do with personal history than what's going on in the present moment. So this is all education. I think boundaries come from the attachments that we learned, and there's two elements in healthy attachment that I think are important. And most of you sitting here, we all attach to somebody, or you wouldn't be in these chairs. Right, David?
Correct.
Yes. So the two important elements, the first is mirroring, the second is constancy. And to the extent that you got these two in a healthy way is the extent to which you will be able to thrive in your relationships. All of us deserve parents who were clear mirrors to us. All of us did. There's a saying, you can't see your own eye without a mirror. You need somebody as infants to reflect your essence back to you and say things to you like, hello, blue eyes. You like to eat, I can see. You're the best little no-sayer. Reflect who they are. If you didn't get enough of this because parents were either too preoccupied with their own pain or, addiction or some kind of ism in the family, if you didn't get enough of mirroring, you will spend your life looking to others to find out who you are. You will spend your life in a desperate search. And when people like you, of course, your esteem is up here. If they don't, it's down here. Nobody got this in a perfect amount. But because there's a neuroplasticity to the brain, we can still have that through therapists, through coaches. The other quality needed in attachment is called constancy. All of us needed a secure base. All of us needed some figure who would come through for us most of the time. Growing up in an addictive family, it was like living in a canoe on the high seas. You don't quite know who's there, and mom says she'll be there and she isn't. Dad says he'll never again, and he does anyway, and it's chaotic or rigid. If you don't get enough constancy, you will anticipate abandonment in all your relationships. And abandonment does funny things, doesn't it? Abandonment, fear, which means either you will provoke someone to leave before they can leave you. You'll jump ship because it's going to happen anyway. But that kind of constancy, you want to know where codependency comes from? It's this. It's the lack of mirroring and constancy. And the way boundaries are destroyed, they're destroyed in two ways. One is intrusion, the other is distancing. It depends. There's all kinds of attachment styles, anxious, avoidant, ambivalent. But intrusion, boundary intruders, interrupting people in mid-sentence, bursting into people's offices unannounced. Abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse, intrusion. And then there's distancing, which is just as painful. Neglect is just as painful as abuse. Has anyone ever been given the silent treatment before? Or know people who withhold love and attention, ignoring? That's distancing. Most people are one or the other. Not that we don't do both. Most of us are one or the other. But boundaries, in terms of emotional sobriety, boundaries, it's about practicing. It's not just about talking about different styles. So I'd like a volunteer, somebody who learns best by doing and not sitting, to come on up here, and you're just going to practice. You want to come up? Great. Can I borrow your water bottle?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Give this woman a hand. You're very brave. What's your name?
Lauren.
Lauren, nice to meet you. Okay. So we're going to go through different styles of what I call giving and receiving. And giving love and receiving love. We all learn a certain style through the way we grew up. But in our adulthood, I think couples need to become aware of how they want to give and how they want to receive attention. And there's no right way to do it. This is a little heavy, but we can try it. Okay. So, Lauren, we're in a relationship. I'm glad. Yeah, nice to meet you. Okay. So there's one style of relating and boundaries where there's no investment in the giving and no investment, you just toss it right back. You know, hi, how are you? You know, I had a car accident today.
Did you?
Yeah. She should have asked me, how's the car? Yeah. It's just a style. There's no investment in the giving, no investment in the receiving. We're both kind of distancers. And so I go through this with couples and, you know, see what feels familiar. I'm going to act this out a little bit more. So, Lauren, this is another style. This is my love and attention, the most precious thing you give anybody, your love and attention. And I want you to have it. Will you take it? Yeah. Can you just tell me, you know, what were you doing at work? You used a real funny tone of voice when I called. Can you tell me what was up with that?
Can you back off, please?
Yeah. Sure. But wait, what time are you coming?
I don't know.
You do love me, don't you?
I don't know about it.
Yeah. I'm sorry to do that. Come on back. Intrusion. And how did it feel? Yeah. Your body.
Yeah, in my face. Yeah, felt intruded.
This is really a dramatic way to do it, but we intrude in all kinds of ways. All kinds of ways. When I come in at the end of the day, I like to be greeted. And I'm more of a boundary intruder. Maybe that surprises you. I'm more of a boundary intruder. And when I don't get, I'm very sensitive to facial expression. So when I come in the house and my partner looks at me, hello, it's shades of mothers here. You know, the heart starts beating, I start getting anxious. Do I leave it there? No. I'll ask again, honey, are you okay? And just say, I'm fine.
I'm fine.
Yeah. But you don't look like you're okay.
I'm a bit, yeah.
You don't. Are you sure? And finally, what he'll do is say, I'm fine. I'm okay. Badgering. Are you okay? Because what I'm doing in the intruder, I'm saying, please manage my anxiety for me. Please. That's what intruder. Can you manage my anxiety for me, please? Will you do that? No, you're not getting paid enough. That's boundary intrusion. That's intrusion. So let me show you the opposite. Okay. This time, this is your love and attention, and give it to me. Remember how precious this is.
Am I just going to do it as I would naturally feel to do it?
Yeah, just the way you want to do it.
Okay.
And I'll be in the kitchen cooking.
Okay.
Eggs. Yeah. Okay. Okay, I'm cooking. Hi.
Hi, I've got something really precious to give to you.
Hold on.
Would you like this? It's really nice.
Oh dear,
It's
1 minute.
Really precious
You know,
to me.
you ask people to come over. I'm trying to make dinner.
I've got something that I really want to give to you because it means a lot to me.
Hold
Would you
on.
mind?
Hold on. Oh, it's nobody. I'm sorry.
Would
What?
you mind taking this? It's very important to me.
What is this?
It's my love and attention.
Oh.
Would you have it?
Sure. Thanks. So, now, I'm sorry to do
No,
that.
it's okay.
In a very, in a trauma bond, what she would do, run and get it, and give it again.
Can you take it, please? Please, because if you don't, I won't be anything. I'll be invisible.
Okay, and then I'm going to go give it to somebody else. She's going to be invisible, but I'm kind of bored with her now. Do you want? I'm kind of invisible. It's hard, right? And I might throw it again. And not only throw it again, but I might kick it. I might stomp it. This is bordering. This is abusive. Distancing is more what I did before. Or she doesn't pick up my dry cleaning and she tries to talk to me, right? And I won't do it. There's all kinds of ways to do this, all kinds of styles of attachment. But when you see a couple and a dynamic, have them act it out. Have them act it out. I mean, they have to have some containment ability or you could get in trouble. But What I asked them is if you could give in any way you'd like to be able to give, with any degree of open-heartedness, how would you like to be able to do that? And if you could receive somebody's love in any way you'd like to receive it, what would you like to do? How would you like to be able to do that? And have them practice. Do you know what you'd like?
I'd like it to be received when I give it.
I bet. Yeah. Okay.
Would you take that?
Yeah, I
you
will.
acknowledge that
Yes.
I'm giving you that?
I acknowledge,
And that it's precious to me?
and it's precious to you. Yeah. And you see what she's doing right now? We're both holding it in the middle, right there. Because if this is new and we're tender and vulnerable, you don't have to receive by taking everything in that you're given.
Tentative.
It's tentative.
Yeah.
So practicing this, this is my love and attention. Oh, good, you're there. And because you could punish me for this. This is my love and attention, and I don't want to surrender my power to you, but I want to surrender to my feelings for you. That's what I'd like to do. And gradually, as I get to know you, it's the letting go, and there's no guarantee. Because right away, I want to take it and put it here, right? Yeah. How would you like to be able to give and receive? Yeah. Lauren, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah. Boy, if we had enough bottles and cups in here, I'd love everybody to try that. Any comments on that or questions about how it's used? Okay. So, hold on a minute. There we go. So what does it take to move from disempowerment to healthy relationships? This is what I've gleaned from a wonderful teacher named David Schnarch. And he wrote a book that was fabulous called The Passionate Marriage. It's a wonderful, wonderful book in working with couples. So what does it take? It takes honesty. It takes self-confrontation. Asking ourselves the question, can I confront myself? Can I stand up for myself? Can I stand up with myself? Whether or not my partner agrees with me or not. And it's called, when you're able to do this, there's a word called differentiation. And differentiation is the ability to stay in connection with somebody without being consumed, without being swallowed up. And the only way we learn about how to practice this honesty, how to practice this, self-confrontation, is by going through relationship crisis. That's the only way you learn this. We don't come out of the womb with the ability to know how to do this. It's through the messy work of relationship that we do learn boundaries. We learn about differentiation. And I'd like to give you it's not a secret recipe, but the new recipe for wonderful relationships. Are you ready for this? You've been waiting for this now? Okay. Drum roll, please. The recipe for healthy relationships. Number 1, self-validation. Number 2, conflict. And unilateral self-disclosure. Boy, this is not what I was taught. I was taught if a couple comes in and they can't talk to each other, you teach them good communication skills. But good communication skills is not going to make a wonderful relationship. I mean, it's helpful. I was taught, we're all taught, that deep intimacy develops through trust and acceptance and validation. Absolutely. Also. And all these are certainly necessary. But to me, this is the powerful recipe. Self-validation. Affirmation is great. I wrote books on affirmation. I love affirmation. Affirmation is great when you can get it, but what do you do when you don't? When you're not validated by somebody? you have to learn to be able to do it yourself. You've got to learn how to be able, and it's not just words. It's really taking the time to have some compassion, read affirmations, talk to friends. You know, if you want a child and all of a sudden your beloved comes home and says, I don't want children, what are you going to do? Thank you for sharing? You have to be able to stand your ground and validate yourself. It's nobody's job to validate us. And couples come thinking that that's my job. My job is to make you feel safe, or your job is to make me feel safe and to validate me. That's not your job. That's going to dissolve this relationship, if that's what you're after. It's nobody's job to make you feel safe. That's an inside job. I mean, people can really threaten that, and you may disagree with me. But if you're after validation, it's going to be very depressing. What can I tell you? Conflict, the second most important ingredient in relationship. Conflict. Conflict shakes up the relationship. It revs up the adrenaline. It increases the level of phenylethylalanine, the stuff that makes you fall in love in the first place. It increases with danger, fear, or risk. That's why people have affairs when they're bored. It shakes up, it's risky. When you start taking emotional risks and are able to tolerate conflict instead of burying it under the rug, it enlivens the relationship. And I'm not talking about raging battles. It increases the dopamine. Why does an oyster develop a pearl? Because it wants to make something beautiful? Why does an oyster develop a pearl? Irritation. Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. And finally, self-disclosure, unilateral self-disclosure, which is the trademark of differentiation, of a healthy relationship. You know, for those of you, I've worked in Patmos the past couple years, and I've read this in Patmos, but I want to read this again because most of the time, couples I work with, self-disclosure sounds like this. Well, I'm going to tell you about me, but only if you tell me about you, and you've got to go first. And you have to tell me about you because I want you to. And by the way, if you don't tell me about you and go first, I'm not going to tell you anything at all. And by the way, you better make me feel safe or I won't talk to you. Something like that. True self-disclosure sounds like this. I don't expect you to agree with me. You were not put on this earth to validate me, but I want you to love me, and you can't do that if you don't know me. I don't want rejection, but I have to face that possibility if I'm ever to feel secure with you. And this is a sideline, if you don't come to terms with your fear of abandonment, you will never be able to act with abandon. If you don't come to terms with your fear of abandonment, you will never be free. So I don't want rejection, but I have to face that possibility if I'm ever to feel secure with you. It's time to show myself to you and be vulnerable. Because one day, when we're no longer on this earth together, I want to know that you really knew me. One day, when we're no longer on this earth together, I want to know that you really knew me. You know how sad it is? You know, I was married to my ex-husband, the poor guy I was telling you about. He's a clergy, and we went to lots of funerals and lots of weddings. But there was nothing more tragic than going to a graveside and have a spouse looking at this person trying to give a eulogy who didn't really know the soul of who this person was. So tragic. It's up to us if we want to be known. If we want to be known. I love that. I love that self-disclosure. I'd be happy to read it again if you want me to. Yes. Okay. Goes like this. I don't expect you to agree with me. Well, for some of us, forget it right there. I don't expect you to agree with me. You weren't put on this earth to validate and reinforce me, but I want you to love me. And you can't do that if you don't know me. I don't want rejection, but I have to face that possibility if I'm ever to feel secure with you. It's time to show myself to you and be vulnerable, because one day when we're no longer on this earth together, I want to know that you really knew me. We want to know that somebody really knew us, right? And sometimes, though, the self-disclosure gets tricky because couples don't know what to say to each other. So sometimes they need a little help. Sometimes they need a little help. So I kind of coach them the kinds of things they can talk about. What I'm grateful for in my life, what challenges are going on right now, what surprises me. Is there anything between us right now that's getting in the way of feeling open-hearted and loving? And there's a woman that I quote often. Her name is Angelise Arian. She's a cross-cultural anthropologist, studied addiction in all kinds of cultures. And she wrote a book called The Fourfold Way. And she came up with something called the four-chambered heart. And I want to show this to you. Because sometimes when couples really can't talk or have trouble talking, they talk about where their heart is. So the question is your heart open or closed? Closed-hearted is anchored in resentment. Is your heart clear or confused? Confused-hearted is ambivalent, anxious, and doubting. Are you clear-hearted or confused-hearted? Are you full-hearted or half-hearted? And half-hearted, you lack the passion or commitment. Also has to do with ambivalence, being half-hearted. And finally, are you strong-hearted or weak-hearted? Weak-hearted lacks the courage to speak the truth, usually. So sometimes, instead of going into all kinds of dialogues, I have couples tell me where their heart is. About, for instance, Rokelle, I have to be honest about going to see you. I feel half-hearted. When it comes to doing what my wife wants with my son in treatment, I feel strong-hearted. So it's just a different way to language things that I find for some couples are really helpful. And, here's the way I want to sum this up. Negotiating skills, communication skills, they're all important. They are. But when somebody in treatment steps up to the plate with a family member and finally speaks from their heart and soul, it isn't done out of safety, is it? Or security.
No.
You finally step up and say what you have to say because your fear of rejection begins to pale in the face of losing your integrity after a while. Communication isn't done in safety and security. And communication, well, put it this way. If you walk into a restaurant, you look around, okay? How can you tell the couples that are dating from the couples who've been together for 10 years? What? Yeah, they look like the dating couple. What are they doing? Like they're leaning, there's energy, right? They're engaging, they're talking. Couple have been together for 10 years. What are they doing? They're eating or they're on their phones. And now sometimes, by the grace of God, there's a comfortable silence between people. That can happen. But that's not what usually I see when I walk in a restaurant. Now, how does the couple that's dating get to be the couple staring at their plates and eating? What happened? There's nothing else to say? What happened to them? No ideas? Could it be that the only things left to be said is what they know the other won't hear, so they just stare at their plate? That the only things left to be said are so far under the rug, and they just assume the other won't hear it anyway, so they won't have that safety. So they just keep shoveling it under the rug. And they can't even talk about the weather anymore without getting irritated. Communication is not an asset, folks, if you can't stand the message. So part of it is communicating, but part of it is tolerating the message you get back. So I just want to say this, that something to keep in mind. The more important someone becomes to you, the more crucial it is to be able to validate, disclose, tolerate conflict. It's not safe to love someone more than you're able to do this, because you will get consumed and you will get lost. The top 4 areas of conflict, what do you think they are? What are the top 4 areas of conflict in couples? Money, children, kids, right, sex, in-laws, relatives, yeah. Relatives. So look, in Murray Bowen, who was a fabulous therapist, Murray Bowen used to say, if you start practicing this stuff at home and somebody isn't telling you, go back the other way, I liked you better before, you probably aren't accomplishing anything, because it will shake things up. But sometimes I think with couples and, in terms of couples, things need to be shaken up a little bit for emotions to get clear. And I'm going to end by just saying this, that I have the best job in the world. I really do. I have the best job in the world. My job is to help addicts and their family members find the miracle of recovery. And by their patience, persistence, and courage, helping them really to develop the following stance, that I am not going to get distracted from who I am, because when I do, I'm pulled away from my connection to myself, and then I have absolutely nothing to give. I'm going to insist, everybody say this last line, I'm going to insist on being who I am, regardless of how you behave. Thank you. And who I am love, I'm integrity, I am courage, I am grace, and I'm going to insist on being that, regardless of how you behave. Folks, that's unconditional love. That's unconditional love. Not that I'm going to find someone who's going to love me no matter what. But I'm a lover, and I'm going to be that love, regardless of how you behave. That's moving from reactivity to integrity. And I was going to end with a song. Are you interested in singing? Yeah? All right. Huh? I'll sing it. All right. So, okay. So, have you ever heard of the I Ching? The I Ching. The I Ching has a quote that I love. It says, I see and I forget. I hear and I remember. I do and I understand. So, couples are, to move from reactivity to integrity, couples need to find the balance for themselves between closeness and distance. And quick story about that. Quick story. I have a neighbor who, she doesn't drink anymore, but she's been on a dry drunk. And crabby. She's just so crabby and irritable. And I was out waiting for the shuttle one day to take me to the airport. And I noticed her. She was reading the paper. And there was some adolescent kids over there. One guy was skateboarding back and forth. And this guy skateboarding came so close to her that I thought he was going to knock the paper out of her hands. And I thought, oh, God. He did it again. And the third time, he did knock the paper out of his hand. He didn't go out. He just came too close to her. And she looked at him and started screaming obscenities at that kid. I mean, it made me blush what she was doing, completely defiling him. Then I saw something really interesting. The truth was her husband left her. And she had just begun to get some help for herself. So the neighbor told me. She screamed at him, and a minute later, she picked up the paper, and she straightened her skirt, and she motioned for that kid to come back. And he did. He did. I thought he'd run away. But he was tall, and he looked down with her, and he had his cap on like that, and he said, yeah? And she said to him, what you did scared me, and I was afraid, and I had no right to talk to you that way, and I'm sorry. And he pulled his hat like that, and he said, How cool. But you know, in that moment, call it a pequeño milagro, a very small healing happens. This is from reactivity to integrity. So everybody raise their hands. All right, so I'm going to take you through a few scenarios of relationship. And first, but we're going to sing It Had to Be You. Do you remember? I couldn't think of a song. This is an oldie. Do you know the tune? It had to be you. All right, is that too low? All right, 1, 2, 3. Ready? It had to be you, just the magical dance of intimacy. It had to be you, the balance between closeness and distance. I've wandered around, finally found somebody. It's not boring, but it's peaceful. Now we're going to do fusion. To make me feel blue. I just can't get out of here. It's so tight. To make me feel blue. It's so symbiotic, I can't move. And don't try to thinking of you. All right, let's do the intrusion. It had to be you. I just want a little closeness. Can I have any? It had to be you. I'm a little needy and I want to know when you're coming home. I wandered around, finally found somebody who just please hug me all the time. Now do sing. Let's see. All right. For nobody else. What we're going to do is the distancing. For nobody else gave me a thrill. I want you. With all your faults, I love you still. I can't tolerate intimacy, so I'm going to disappear. It had to be you. Take a breath, everybody, and do closest and distance in. This is what it feels like. It had to be you. It had to be you. I've wandered around, finally found somebody. The ebb and flow of relationship. God, you can stop now. You can stop now.